Welcome, everybody. So good to have you here today at all three of our Parker Hill campuses as we gather in one church in 3 locations across northeastern Pennsylvania. And if you're here with us for the very first time today, you picked a great time to be here because today we are launching a brand new series. It's called Doubtless. And for the month of February, we're going to be talking about some of those big questions, the doubts that people carry with them about God and about Christianity. And we're going to wrestle with some of those questions and seek to help you understand what might be behind some of those doubts. And I thought it would be good as we begin this series just to kind of say a word about doubt, because it may be that you're a follower of Christ and you feel some doubt from time to time about your faith and about your relationship with God, and you wonder if that's normal. And you wonder if maybe your doubt is an indication that your faith isn't really authentic. And so you just kind of push that down into the background and you stuff it down mentally and you just put a smile on your face and move on, but never really deal with that doubt. So here's what I want you to understand as we begin this new series. I want you to understand that doubt is a normal part of the spiritual journey. In fact, I've been a pastor now for 28 years, so I'm like a professional Christian. And here's what you should know about me. I struggle with doubt and with questions from time to time. And sometimes I wonder, is this whole thing, this thing I've given my life to, is this really true? Now, don't get me wrong, I don't struggle with those kind of doubts or questions very often, but from time to time I do, especially in times of loss or in times of crisis or in times of criticism. And I figure, if I struggle with doubt from time to time, probably most of you do too. In fact, I thought it would be good just to take a very informal doubt survey as we begin this series. So on every campus, if you would describe yourself as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, and if you've ever from time to time struggled with doubt, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm raising my hand. If you ever struggle with doubt, raise your hand. All right, good. Look around, because that puts us all on level ground. And in case you're here and you're not a Christian, that should be very encouraging to you. Like, we're confused too, so join us. No, you don't have to have it all figured out. Here's the thing about doubt. Doubt is a part of life, and it's a natural part of faith. The question isn't whether or not you will ever face doubt. The question is, what are you going to do with that doubt when it rises up in your heart? Because if you just ignore it, here's what it tends to do. It tends to fester, and it tends to just get bigger. And what we need to do is we got to wrestle with our doubt. We've got to ask the questions, and we got to seek the answers to those questions. And when we wrestle with our doubt, here's what happens. Our faith actually grows a little bit stronger. Tim Keller, in his book, The Reason for God, has a section in the introduction about doubt, and he says it so well. He says this. He says, a faith without some doubts is like a human body without any antibodies in it. People who go through life too busy or indifferent to ask hard questions about why they believe as they do will find themselves defenseless against either the experience of tragedy or the probing questions of a smart skeptic. A person's faith can collapse almost overnight if she has failed over the years to listen patiently to her own doubts. So for the next few weeks, We're going to listen patiently to our own doubts, wrestle with them, and seek to answer those doubts. And there are two things that I hope will happen. Number one, here's what I hope will happen as you listen in on this teaching over the next few weeks. I hope, number one, that we'll address some of the doubts that rise up in your heart from time to time and maybe give you some answers to those deep questions about God and about your faith. But secondly, I hope this will happen as well. I hope in the process we can give you the ability to have some meaningful conversations with friends and family members who may have their own doubts about God and His existence and Christianity and the Bible and all of that stuff, because you may be the only person in their life that will have the opportunity to answer those doubts and help them take a step in God's direction. Well, today, as we begin this series, we're going to be exploring an area that may be, in my opinion, the most common reason for rejecting the Christian faith. And it's not doubts about the Bible, not doubts about who Jesus was, not doubts about, how God and science fit together. I think there are a lot of people who struggle to believe in Christ simply because of what they see in the lives of His followers. In other words, I think there are some people who doubt the message of Christianity because of the messengers. And this plays out in a couple of different ways. One of the ways this plays out is there are some people who look back through history and they see certain things that were done in the name of religion that were wrong. For instance, some people talk about the Crusades. There was a period of about 200 years, there were 8 crusades when the Catholic Church actually went to war against Muslims in an attempt to take back the Holy Land. Tens of thousands of people died, and people look at that and they wonder about that. Or people sometimes look back to the Inquisitions when religious leaders persecuted or even killed people because they didn't hold the right set of beliefs. Or some people look back to the 1600s and they think about the witch trials when people who were suspected of witchcraft were put to death. And so there are some people who look back through history in certain periods of time and they have doubt, and they express their doubt through a question that can sound something like this: why would I want to become a Christian when religion has created so many problems throughout history? But then there are other people who've rejected Christ, not because of what they've seen in history, but because of what they've seen in other people who claim to be followers of Christ. And they see a level of hypocrisy there that causes them to ask a different question that has to do with their doubt. And they ask this question: why would I want to become a Christian when the church is filled with so many hypocrites? See, there are people who walk away from faith, who walk away from the church. There are people who embrace atheism, not because they've explored it intellectually, not because they think science has all the answers, but because they just can't get past what they've seen in the lives of some Christians. And this doubt and this idea, I don't know if you know this or not, this has gained great momentum in the last 10 to 12 years. And one thing that's fueled the momentum behind this kind of doubt are some books that have been written by some very popular authors. Like back in 2004, Sam Harris wrote a book entitled The End of Faith. And that book was rejected by 12 publishers because they felt it was too controversial. The 13th publisher picked it up, and then it spent 33 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Listen to a quote from the introduction. He says this: once we have examined the problem inherent to faith and the threat that even moderate religious faith now poses to our survival, in other words, I'm a threat to our survival, we can begin to situate our ethical institutions within the context of a rational worldview. I was on a flight a couple of years ago, and I sat down next to a guy, and I looked over. He was reading that book. He was most of the way through it. And a few minutes into the flight, he closes the book, he puts it away, he turns to me, introduces himself. I say, yeah, my name's Mark. He says, so what do you do for a living? And I'm like, I don't want to tell you. And it led to a fascinating conversation. That same year, in 2004, another book was published, this book by Richard Dawkins, a book entitled The God Delusion. This book was so popular, it was translated into 35 different languages. Listen to what he writes. He says, faith can be very dangerous, and to deliberately implant it into the vulnerable mind of an innocent child is a grievous wrong. So if you're a parent trying to pass on your faith to the next generation, he's speaking about you. A year later, Christopher Hitchens wrote a book entitled God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Within 3 weeks, it was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. In his book, he says this. He says, as I write these words and as you read them, people of faith are, in their different ways, planning your and my destruction. Religion poisons everything. As well as a menace to civilization, it has become a threat to human survival. Oh, my goodness. These books sold millions of copies. These guys became rock stars. They were on late night TV talk shows. They were on YouTube videos. There's been a shift in our culture. So here's my question. If you were to have a conversation like I did on that flight with a guy who had just, or a woman who had just read one of these books, what would you say? How would you answer them about this brand of doubt? Here's one thing that I think we need to recognize, and I need to say this right up front, that there are things in church history that are inexcusable. And there are things that people do today as Christians and in the name of Christ that are just downright bad, and we need to own that and we need to admit that. Okay, let's just say that right up front. But beyond that, when this doubt rises up in your heart, when you begin a conversation with somebody who doubts the Bible and God and Christianity because of this kind of stuff that they've seen, let me tell you 3 things to do, or more specifically, 3 things not to do. #1 is this: don't be distracted. In other words, don't be distracted from Jesus by those who claim to be his followers. Don't let the people of God, quote unquote, distract you from the heart of God, because here's why. You can't judge the truth of the message by the lives of the messengers. In other words, just because people don't live up to the message, that does not mean that the message itself is not true. In fact, we need to recognize this. In every area of life, there are people who don't live up to what they say they believe. That's not unique to religion. That's not unique to Christianity. In every sphere of life, there are people who are hypocrites. They don't live up to what they say they believe. In fact, a few years ago, there was a very interesting news article in the Boston Globe. The headline of the article was this: at convention, heart doctors lean toward burgers and fries. Very interesting article. Let me read a few paragraphs for you. Some of the 30,000 doctors, nurses, and researchers at the American Heart Association's annual meeting talk healthy diets out of one side of their mouth and put burgers and fries in the other. At lunch yesterday, they clogged their arteries with meals high in cholesterol, fat, and sodium, all of which contribute to heart disease. Fast food was just as popular among those at the Heart Association meeting as it is with the people at other conventions, said the director of sales. Then the article goes on, and in the article they interview some of the doctors who were there, and I love what this one doctor said. It was convenient and quick, Dr. Paul Colavita said as he gulped down a big bacon burger and biggie fries at a Wendy's near the convention site. But doesn't it set a bad example for him to be seen eating fatty meals? Listen to this. Not me, because I took my name tag off. There's some Christians I wish they would take their name tag off, right? Like, listen, there are lots of doctors who probably don't practice the advice they give to their patients, right? But does that mean you give up on medicine? Does that mean that you stop going to doctors? No, because it would be incredibly unwise to reject the message because of the messengers. And here's the truth about the church. Here's the truth about this movement that Jesus started almost 2,000 years ago. The truth is that since the very beginning, there have been followers of Christ who just didn't get it all right all the time, and they blew it. In fact, very interesting story right from the Bible. On the night that Jesus was being arrested and he was going to be crucified the next day by the Romans, he was being arrested, and he was there in the Garden of Gethsemane, and his disciples are there. And one of his disciples, Peter, pulls out a sword, and he just starts swinging the thing. And he cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest, a guy whose name was Malchus. Here's what happens next, Luke 22. But Jesus answered, no more of this. And he touched the man's ear and healed him. And I think you always need a little bit of imagination when you read the Bible. And I'm thinking Jesus is like, Peter. He gets the ear and he's like, I'm so sorry about my disciple. Yeah, I've been working with him for 3 years, but he still doesn't quite get it yet. So sorry about the whole ear thing. You know, man, that guy had a story to tell, right? Here's my point. The number one disciple spent 3 years walking with Jesus, learning with Jesus, and he blew it. He tried to do what he thought it was right, and he just kind of messed it up. You see, still today, there are going to be Christians who don't represent Jesus very well, but don't let them distract you from Christ himself, because it's an incredible mistake to reject the truth of the message because of the lives of the messengers. Let me give you a way that may help you to remember this whole idea. Probably not many of you know this, but I play the harmonica. I actually began playing it 2 days ago. So when I bought my harmonica 2 days ago, I thought to myself, Mark, you got to go big or go home. So I decided I'm not going to start by learning Mary Had a Little Lamb, okay? I'm going to start with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. It is the most recognizable, one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever composed. Just in case you've forgotten it, listen to about 20 seconds of Beethoven's Fifth. That is awesome, isn't it? That is like a moving, beautiful piece of music. So here we go. A few bars from Beethoven's Fifth. Here we go. Yeah. Right there. I'm available for weddings and special events. You can go on our website and sign up. Okay, here's my question. Is it fair, or is it even reasonable to judge the beauty of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony based on my performance? No, it isn't. And here's my point spiritually. There are a lot of us Christ followers walking around trying to do our best to follow him, but let's be honest. Sometimes we're like amateur harmonica players trying to perform Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and it doesn't go very well. You can't judge the beauty of that music or the talent of that composer based on my performance, and you can't make a judgment about Jesus based on the way that his followers live, because Christians will disappoint you. Christ never will, because that song, the song of his message, the song of his life, is still, no matter who plays it, the most beautiful music ever written in history. So don't be distracted by the messengers. Don't be distracted from the message. Here's the second thing. When you're dealing with this kind of doubt that surrounds the lives of believers, don't be surprised, and you shouldn't be surprised, because here's the truth. The most broken people will be the most attracted to Christ. I think it's crucial that we understand the gospel. I think it's crucial that we understand the message that Jesus brought. It was not a promise of perfection. It was an invitation to grace. And see, to be a follower of Christ means that you come to the point where you realize how messed up you really are. And where you come to the point where you realize that you're broken and sinful, and in realizing that, you run toward a God whose arms are open wide, who will forgive you and accept you, and who will begin to change you from the inside out. And here's the truth about that message. Sometimes the most broken people in the world are most attracted to that message. In fact, Jesus talked about this in Luke chapter 5. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Do you know what that means? That means that if the church is doing the job that the church is supposed to do, there are going to be really messed up people with a lot of problems who are going to find Jesus and begin a new journey with Him. And they're going to come to faith in Christ, they're going to find forgiveness, and they're going to carry with them all the baggage of their past, like I did and you did. And the hope is that along the way, that some of that baggage begins to fall off, right? And we become the people we're called to be, and we grow in character, and we grow in faith, and we become more like Christ. But that doesn't happen instantly. It doesn't happen quickly. And so a healthy church will be full of imperfect people, broken people, because that's who the message of the gospel is most attractive to. Again, Timothy Keller, in his book, The Reason for God, he says this better than I ever could. Here's what he writes. He says, imagine that someone with a very broken past becomes a Christian and her character improves significantly over what it was. Nevertheless, she still may be less secure and self-disciplined than someone who is so well adjusted that she feels no particular need for religious affiliation at all. Suppose you meet both of these women in the same week. Unless you know the starting points and the life journeys for each woman, you could easily conclude that Christianity isn't worth much and that Christians are inconsistent with their own high standards. It is often the case that people whose lives have been harder and who are lower on the character scale are more likely to recognize their need for God and turn to Christianity. So we should expect that many Christians' lives would not compare well to those of the non-religious. He says, just as the health of those in hospitals is comparatively worse than people visiting museums. You know what he's saying? He's saying, don't be surprised when Christians are far from perfect, because the most broken people are the people who are often most attracted to the message of Christ. And you know what? One of the best things that we can do for those of us who are followers of Christ is we can stop pretending. We can stop acting holier than thou, and we can stop having such a condemning spirit and attitude toward people in this world. And remember that the only reason we're here is by grace, because the world hates hypocrisy. But let me tell you what the opposite of hypocrisy is. The opposite of hypocrisy is not perfection. The opposite of hypocrisy is authenticity. Recognizing how broken you really are and admitting that and just owning that and being so thankful for God's grace. So if you ever have doubts about faith because of what you see in history or because of what you see in the lives of some of the followers of Christ, number one, don't be distracted. Don't be distracted from Him. Don't be distracted from the message by the messengers. Number two, don't be surprised, because the very message of grace is a message that attracts all of us very broken people. But number three is this: don't be deceived. Don't be deceived, because here's the truth. An honest assessment of history shows that the influence of Christianity has been far more positive than negative. This really is true if you stop and think about it honestly. And there are voices in our culture today who say that this world would be a far better place without religious faith, especially without Christianity, like some of the quotes I read to you a few minutes ago. But I would suggest to you that anyone who says that is either being dishonest or is completely ignorant of the truth about history. Because if you really want to know what a culture looks like without faith, all you have to do is look at those nations where faith was outlawed and where the leaders of those nations were committed to atheism. And you don't even have to look any further than the 20th century. I mean, think back to the years between 1900 and 2000. In the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev, a nation that was committed to atheism, 66 million people died during that time because of the policies, and some of the policies directly related to religion and to support of the government. 66 million people. In China, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, during a 5-year period of time called the Great Leap Forward, 38 million people died, many of them starving in camps where they were placed. Or think about Germany under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. 21 million people died, not just Jewish people, but anyone who assisted them and anyone who was perceived to be a threat to his leadership. Or the country of Cambodia under Pol Pot. In 4 years' time, under his dictatorial leadership, 25% of the population died. In a country of 8 million, 2 million people died. That's just the 20th century alone. 120 million people died under the leadership of leaders who did not embrace faith, but who rejected faith. And see, it's a simple fact of history that the greatest evil is always committed in cultures where God is rejected, not in places where God is embraced. But what about the other side of the coin? What about the positive side of the coin? If we were to kind of step back and look objectively at human history, would we say that Christianity overall has been a positive influence or a negative influence? You know, Jesus predicted that his movement, the church, and his people would be a blessing to this world. In Matthew chapter 13, he tells this very interesting story, a parable. It says, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree. He says the kingdom of God is like this tiny seed that becomes a tree. He's talking about the church, his kingdom, that at that moment, as he was saying this, it consisted of a handful of very, very ordinary men. But he said someday, this will be like the largest tree in the garden, a movement that will be larger than anything history had ever seen. It's amazing that he would see that. And then he says this, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. He's saying that his kingdom, his church, would be a place of refuge. It would be a place of safety. It would be a place of blessing, that his people would be a blessing to this world. And here's the thing. I think anyone who takes an honest look at history would have to agree that this world would be a very different place in the last 2,000 years without the influence of the message of Christianity and the followers of Christ. A few years ago, I read a book entitled How Christianity Changed the World. Fascinating book. It's based on reams and reams of research. It's very well written, and it talks about the positive effect that Christianity has had on the world and even on our culture specifically over the last couple of hundred years. And there are a number of general statements that are made, but then there are some examples that are given as well. And I thought I'd just pull a few examples out of this book to help you understand how Christianity, the faith that we embraced, really has changed the world. In his book, he talks about a guy named George Williams. George Williams was a devout follower of Christ. And the great burden of his heart is that he would be able to provide a place where young men could escape the perils of the inner city and have a place of refuge. So in 1844, he founded the Young Men's Christian Association, what we know today as the YMCA. This was the purpose statement for the YMCA when it was founded: for the winning of young men to Jesus Christ and the building in them of Christian character. Think about that when you go swimming at the Y next time. In 1860, Florence Nightingale founded the very first nursing school and developed a system for training nurses. She is considered to be the founder of modern nursing. What drove her to do this was her faith. She was convinced to the core of her being that she was doing what she was doing because God had called her to do it. Interestingly enough, at the end of her life, before she died, she made a request. She requested that a cross be engraved on her headstone and that only her initials would be under it, not her name, because she didn't want people to remember her name. They wanted people to remember the name and the love of her Savior. In 1863, a man named Henry Dunant founded the Red Cross, an organization that meets the needs of people who are suffering in war or natural disaster. He was, by the way, the very first recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. He was motivated to do this by the example of Christ because he was a follower of Christ. On his deathbed, he said this. He said, "I am a disciple of Christ as in the first century, nothing more." William Booth, who was a pastor in the city of London, gave up a very secure job leading his church so that he could take the message of Christ and the message of hope into the streets of London because he wanted to reach the poor and the homeless and the hungry and the destitute. He founded the Salvation Army, which today serves the poor and the outcast in over 100 countries around the world. And those are just a few examples. Add to that the good works of every humble servant of Christ who has ever given to the poor, who has ever come alongside the hurting, who has ever loved the forgotten. And when you think about that, you quickly realize that this world would be a much darker, much different much more dangerous place if it were not for the message of the gospel and the message of Christianity and followers of Christ. But I'll tell you what, I don't have to read a book to know that, because I see it every single day, and I see it here. And I know there are hypocrites in the church just like in every other human organization. In fact, sometimes I'm the biggest hypocrite because I teach about it and sometimes don't live up to it. And I know all that. But when I look at the church, I don't see what Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins see. I see beauty. I see power. I see lives being transformed. I see a church where 200 families sponsor kids in Haiti and in Kenya so that they can get a good education and break the cycle of poverty in their homes. I see here a church where we gathered 1,000 backpacks and gave them to Lackawanna College's Rocket Project so they went to the homes of some low-income families as they started the school year. And I see here a church where in a few weeks we're going to have a group of probably 175 high school students who will commit themselves to going without food for 30 hours so that they can raise money, not for themselves, but for people and for kids in another part of the world. I see a church where last Christmas we invited you to participate in a $10 Christmas offering, and you did, and we gave away over $25,000 to a women's shelter in Scranton and a women's homeless shelter in Wilkes-Barre. And I see a church where this Friday we're going to have a huge party called Night to Shine for special needs people in our community. We got over 500 volunteers who are going to help with that. I mean, that stuff, that is worth celebrating. See, that's what I see. That's what I see when I look at the church. So let me give you a challenge. Here's my challenge to you. In your sphere of influence, change the perception. In your sphere of influence, counteract this doubt. Because here's the truth. There are some people in your life, and you may be the only follower of Christ that they will ever meet. You may be the only image in the way that you live. You may be the only image that they ever see of God's Son and His heart for them. And you can be the person who breaks down the barrier for someone else. We can't change everybody's opinion, but we can change a few opinions. And here's why this is so important. You will never argue somebody into God's kingdom. All of our best, tightly reasoned arguments, all of our best words, all of our most convincing speeches will never break down the barrier. What will change people's hearts is the way that we live, accompanied by what we say graciously. The most compelling argument for the truth of the gospel will be the lives of the people who say they believe it. Just as people are turned off to Christ by His followers, I believe that they can be turned toward Christ by His followers if we understand how we're called to live. In fact, way back in the first century, Peter, the guy who chopped the ear off Malchus, he still got to be, a leader in the early church, and he writes this letter to the Christians, and he says, "Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul." And then he goes on to say this, "Live such good lives among the pagans." And by the way, the pagans were not a first century motorcycle gang, okay? That was his word that he used for people who had rejected God completely. And he says, live such good lives among them. Notice he does not say make such good arguments. He doesn't say have such good, snappy Facebook posts. He says live such good lives among the pagans, such good lives, that though they may accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. You see, when we live lives that are attractive and authentic, when we show compassion and integrity and grace to the people around us, we are taking away one of the biggest doubts that people have about the faith. Yeah, I mentioned Facebook. Can I tell you, that's just a great place to start on social media. And I think about that, especially coming out of a heated political season. Right? And I see so much stuff on Facebook where people are just giving these uninformed, broad brush criticism of people groups, sarcastic comments, and some of them are Christians. And it breaks my heart because sometimes I think there are Christians who are more concerned about a political agenda than they are about the gospel because they don't mind offending people for the sake of their political viewpoint. I mean, that's just one example. There's so many ways that we can speak and live such good lives among the people around us who've rejected the God who loves them so much, that we can get them to break down their walls, get rid of their doubts, and begin to maybe move in His direction. So, once I perfect Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the next piece of music I'm going to learn on my harmonica is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It's a beautiful piece of music. I was told that Beethoven wrote this piece of music for a friend of his who was blind because he wanted his blind friend to understand through the music the beauty of a moonlit night. And I thought to myself, that's what we're called to do. We're called to show a spiritually blind world the beauty of God's heart through the music of our lives. And you guys are doing that so well. Let's keep doing that and do it even better.